Hi there, welcome to the video. I'm your host, John Ivison. This week I am joined by Marc Miller, who is the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Marc, delighted you could take the time to join us. For the uninitiated, Marc is the MP, and let me get this right, for the Montreal riding of Ville-Marie, Le Sud-Ouest, Île-de-Sur.
Perfect Scottish brogue for... No, it's you got it better than most people. Most people don't know where it is, but it's downtown Montreal.
Downtown Montreal.
Yeah.
You were previously Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. You were or are a lawyer. You were an infantry officer. Don't know whether you're still in the reserve.
Soldier. No. I 4 years was enough for me.
You were the first person to deliver a speech in Mohawk in the House of Commons. Talk us through that. Why Mohawk?
To be honest, it may sound like some big act of deliberation and forethought, but I was pretty naive. I was doing a bunch of consultations with Carolyn Bennett at the time. She was coming to my riding to talk to people about Indigenous languages and preserving languages. And I thought, how hard is it to learn Mohawk? One of the elders had observed that within a generation, these languages could be wiped out. Mohawk's particularly is a Iroquoian language. It's the more prominent of Iroquoian languages, but it's threatened. There's only 2,000 people that speak it fluently. There's lots of people trying to relearn it, and I thought, how hard is it for a guy like me to learn it? It's pretty freaking hard. And I searched out a little Mohawk teacher, and he took a chance on me. His name's Awanadeka Brian Miracle, who had a stint at the CBC when Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister, but he decided to teach language courses in Six Nations, and him and his daughter took me on and taught me some stuff. And
was it a political motivation to try? I mean,
nothing. It was just
bilingual.
He thought it would be a good experiment. I thought it would be a good experiment, and I had some colleagues that were trying to learn French, and I was given French and English as a child, so I thought, why not try it myself? It's really hard. I still do it, but it was sort of a leap of faith. And after I spoke it in the House of Commons, my wife basically said, if you don't continue your classes, you're more full of crap than I know you already be. So I took that to heart, and I keep doing it. I do it to empty my brain and just as a mental exercise. But it's also...
I'm learning Spanish right now. It is not easy learning I'm in late middle age. I'm just a youngster. But
you don't tough. Have any Latin languages under your belt, right? So it's not as easy as French.
The note perfect French, which you just
which I just witnessed. But anyway, I keep doing it. It's people joked when I became the Minister of Indigenous Affairs that I talked my way into the job, but it had nothing to do with that. I just met a lot of people, met some great people, and built some great relationships. So a lot less deliberation than you would want to ascribe after the fact to it.
My other useless tidbit about you is that you, on a post-graduation tour of Africa with the Prime Minister, who you went to school with, you beat the local strongman to an arm wrestling competition in Mali, which is true, right?
It is. He asked me. It was funny because an MP came up to me and started talking to me about arm wrestling, and I was like, "How did you know that? Someone must have told you that." And she said, "Well, it's in this book." And then I said, "Why'd you put that stupid thing in your book?" He's like, "You mean you haven't read my book?" And I was like, No, I haven't read your book, and I don't plan to. But I got chastised for not reading the book when I didn't even get an answer to why he'd put this in. But I did. It was this thing where we all had gotten to a local watering hole and had been properly watered, and there was some bets being put on whether you could beat this guy who didn't know how to do arm wrestling. But he was built 3 times the size. Totally unfair, but he was a lot bigger than me, and a lot of people made money off it that bet against me. But it makes for a good story.
For sure. Okay, so you've been in the news of late in the last week, and I'd like to set up why, if I can. As many viewers will know, the number of temporary foreign workers and international students exploded last year, helping to boost the country's population by over 3%, which was the fastest rate since the 1950s. Now, unlike the number of permanent residents, which you set ahead of time, it's about 500,000 this year, there is no cap, or was no cap, on temporary arrivals. And as the country came out of COVID, there were a lot of job vacancies, nearly 1 million in 2022, I think. The government made some decisions to address that, allowing students to work more than 20 hours in any given week, you allowed some industries to recruit up to 30% of their workforce from foreign workers. You designed pathways to help people who were temporary residents become permanent residents and then citizens. Now, all of that might have restrained wage growth and, I guess, helped not fuel inflation, but at the same time it also contributed to the affordability crisis by sending rents sky high, 8% last year, although in some rent-controlled provinces it would be closer to 20% if you're a new tenant. You summed it all up, I thought, very well, saying it's a bit of a mess. Can you tell us what you've just done to try and course correct?
Yeah, and I think that probably sets the scene fairly well, John. And I think it's not a regrets moment. I do think that coming out of COVID and even navigating COVID, looking at the labor shortage that we walked into COVID with, a lot of these measures made sense at the time. And in an area where we have never really capped temporary foreign workers, and we don't do the best job analyzing the carry-on effects of our public policy decisions all the time, there was a need at this point in time to start taking a look at, what is 6.2% of the population, 6.3% of the population based on 2023 numbers, and realizing that it's doubled or even close to tripled in the last very short period of time. This isn't the sole contributing factor to the cost of shelter or the cost of buying a new house. House equities have doubled, tripled in a very short period of time. Interest rates have jumped. Everyone is feeling the affordability crisis in a lot of areas. But to the extent that it's a contributing factor, it was one that, as we were reflecting internally on it, we needed to get a handle on. The problem with the particular picture of temporary residency or presence in Canada is it's wildly misunderstood. I think most people think it's people that come in low wage streams that are working in fields or working in the fish processing industry. That's only a very small percentage of the picture. It's asylum seekers. It is the people that we welcome from Ukraine, 300,000 people that are here for humanitarian reasons. It's also the real growth of international students and the postgraduate work permits that are associated to them, which have really constitute, I would say, about 40% of the proposition. And then it's all these specialized programs, whether it's under our trade agreements with other countries, international mobility agreements, youth mobility agreements that have really sort of created this balloon. Not all elements are equal, and each of them contribute in different ways to the cost of shelter. None of those categories is competing with me for the renewal of my mortgage, but everyone feels the crunch of that. So I think there are some narratives that we need to explore when we say this has caused that. But certainly numbers are undeniable, and it's something that had gotten out of control, whether it's international students or any other category. I took a bunch of measures in the fall and in January that are still in the process of unfolding in terms of capping numbers. We need to have an additional conversation on bringing that number back to 5%, which is it's a 20% drop. So it's going to require a lot of discussions with provinces, a lot of discussions with businesses and unions to make sure that we actually get this right. There's a number of economists that have said that this measure might make things worse. Most of them agree that this will make things better in terms of affordability. So we have to have that conversation with provinces that do have some responsibility over their labor markets, know their numbers, know their needs, and make sure that everyone knows what they're getting into when we're trying to achieve this target, which I think is attainable, but we need to put a little work into it.
So you are going to put a target on temporary residents the same way you do with permanent residents, right? That's coming?
Yeah, I mean, right now that's the signal that we're sending to the market. That's the signal we're sending to provinces and territories. But I need to sit down with them and say, guys, let's sort this out. Let's figure out where we tap these increases, where we look at decreases, and make some adjustments. That's the inflow part of it, John. The outflow is also a very important portion of the conversation, because it deals with how we make people permanent in this country. And it doesn't make sense to constantly strand people here, either leave them here, ask them to go home. For a lot of these categories, there is a natural transition to being a permanent resident and then a permanent and then a Canadian. So making sure that provinces are responsible to do domestic draws where they see labor markets available, they're not going abroad constantly to bring people in, which does increase the numbers of people coming in. And that us, as Canada, who have responsibility of the majority of those federal envelopes in bringing people in, are looking for domestic draws so that we deal with the process of outflow, so we don't just strand people in this sort of temporary precarious position in Canada, which is not something that's healthy for people's rights, not necessarily ultimately healthy for the economy.
So you've got far fewer vacancies now than you had. The economy has maybe 630,000 vacancies compared to nearly 1 million. The percentage of workers that companies can bring in is still higher than it was pre-pandemic. It went up to 30% for some industries. You've brought that down to 20%. But I think I'm right in saying it was 10% pre-pandemic. Is your target to bring that back to where it was before?
I think we need to take a look at the possibility of that. I think we'll have to see how the market adjusts to 20%. And you're right, it was 10% prior to going into COVID. This was a measure that was taken by my colleague Randy Boissonneau. I think it's the right one. But as we engage with industry and players, I think we'll have to see if this is the right mark or whether we turn it another ratchet length.
I mean, wasn't all this eminently foreseeable? Your predecessor, Sean Fraser, was warned that there could be unintended consequences of allowing students essentially to become a parallel labour pool to the temporary foreign workers.
Yeah, and I think in fairness to Sean, he did ring a number of alarm bells. When we get memos from public servants, you get the pros, you get the cons. It would be wrong for them not to highlight the downside of some of the stuff that we decide to take ultimately. This is what you do, and as a responsible minister, you take informed risk. He certainly was working with provinces at the time that I took over to make sure that we had everyone on the same page as to where we were going with this. I have no doubt that we would have gotten here anyway if he had continued, because I know what he told me and encouraged me to do when I took over, and I heeded it. So I think this was something that, as we looked at the curve that was jumping up like a hockey stick to about 1.4 million students, if we didn't put a cap on this, it was absolutely the right thing to do, but in a smart way where we sort of redistributed by province, kind of rewarding better provinces where things hadn't gotten out of control, and really asking the provinces like BC and Ontario principally to ratchet back their numbers significantly. These are multi-billion-dollar propositions, and they are ones that are not without consequences to local economies, to institutions, but also to governments that have been provincial governments that have, in some cases, taken close to about $1,000 per student entering into the country.
There were a lot of bad faith actors involved in this, from predatory recruitment, people who were telling foreign students they could come in, they were guaranteed a job at the end, and they would eventually move on to become citizens. The institutions you've mentioned that were providing probably not good value for money for the exorbitant tuition fees they were charging. And then businesses as well that have been abusing the labour market assessment process. You end up with some students who are so destitute they're claiming asylum. How do you, as the federal minister, try and bring all that back into check?
Yeah, I mean, we have to have an honest conversation with with institutions, which I'm continuing to have, but also with provinces, as to what this program was designed for in the first place. It was designed towards excellence. It was designed to bring people into this country with a bunch of skills to benefit from the top education system, one of the top education systems in the world. It has not become that. There have been lots of cries about how this measure will affect the international reputation of Canada, which is still very good, but there's also the reputation that Canada is a program that is very good for people to get citizenship and as a backdoor entry into Canada, as you mentioned. And in provinces like Ontario, the last 3 years of the post-secondary education system have generated about 10,000 asylum seekers, which is not the sign of a good education system. In fact, it's surprising that someone would claim asylum based on 3 years of education at a Canadian institution. There are reasons for that. There are sometimes real elements of persecution, but the persecution can't be a crappy education and a $50,000 per year fee for attending those universities. And that is something we're going to have that very serious conversation with provinces in terms of who assumes the responsibility for the people that are here, how you better align the job prospects of people graduating for a number of these institutions into these labor markets where provinces and those institutions themselves say these people are very needed, but the data to me points elsewhere. I'm trying to ratchet back the number of hours that we're allowing students to work, but my biggest concern for people presently in Canada, because we have to treat these young, they're mostly young kids with humanity and dignity, is not to curtail this in a way such as they would be destitute because they're paying $40,000-$50,000. So,
but should foreign students be allowed to work off campus at all? I mean, if they're here for an education.
It's a good question, and I think most of the countries that we compete for these people for allow it. They don't allow necessarily 40 hours a week. I think the internet, looking at the numbers, the international, it's something over 20 hours, 25 hours in some cases. We are charging, or institutions are charging these people a lot, 30, 40, 50,000 in some cases. You can't make that money by slinging beer at the local university pub or doing a TA position or whatever. There are jobs that are needed, and I think there is a need for those people to study off campus. I don't see why they would be hindered in that, but not 40 hours and probably not 30. I'm not the best example of work ethic in university because my focus was elsewhere, to say the least, but I was able to put together a 20-hour work week at times. 30, 40 hours is untenable.
Yeah. The broader criticism of your government is that immigration policy has long been viewed as a way to grow the economy's productive capacity by bringing in the best and brightest. The criticism is that at some point in the last couple of years, that priority seems to have shifted to plugging holes in the labour market, and not even at the high end, at the low end. The Bank of Nova Scotia says 2/3 of the decline in productivity that we've seen in recent times has been due to the unchecked population surge. Would you like to reset immigration policy, put it back on a course where the priority is to make everybody better off by, for example, improving GDP per capita?
Yes. I mean, yes and no. There is a natural curve to GDP per capita that follows basically how people age. People being at the end of their career will be more productive than people at the beginning of the career. We've got a sort of a countervailing policy challenge in terms of making the labor force younger. And the demographic curve, I think, that weighs over any G7 country is something that probably keeps most immigration ministers up at night. Overdoing that is what creates and I think fuels these debates over GDP product and basic productivity measures. We're never going to get away from that GDP per capita debate. There are, in my mind, sometimes better measurements when you look at household GDP as you measure it, so that it nets out countries where the incentive for higher capital earners to shelter their money. There's all sorts of debates around that I won't necessarily get into because we don't have a couple hours to debate it. But I do think it is a concern when it's highlighted and we manifestly trail behind similarly situated countries. We're often compared to the U.S. I think sometimes there are nuances that are important to draw out. But when we talk about productivity, I think it's important to talk about what exactly we are trying to measure and trying to correct for. I don't necessarily think that. I do actually think we could do a better job in innovation. It's always been a constant criticism in Canada. I know my colleague Francois-Philippe Champagne, who is an interminable source of energy, is focused a lot on bringing that type of innovation to Canada and fostering it. And we can't just simply rely on immigration. It has to be smarter immigration and better policies to better match with what the market needs are, and not necessarily constantly dealing with volume propositions, which is what I'm trying to tailor right now.
Just finally, immigration has not been an election issue in Canada. I don't see the xenophobia that we see elsewhere, except perhaps at the political fringes. But there does seem to be a differentiation emerging between you and the Conservatives. Pierre Poilievre has been opaque about it, but he has said that he would link population growth to housing construction through some sort of undefined mathematical formula. Do you think that the consensus on immigration is still holding? And should we be linking population growth to housing availability?
Well, I think first, John, you're right. I think generally the prominent parties in Canada have avoided it. Frankly, at the beginning of our mandate, the Conservative Party was more publicly vocal about it. At least I give them the credit for being honest about it. Right now, there are insinuations and obscure mathematical formula trying to tie immigrations to housing more. Pierre Poilievre's logic on that has always escaped me as to what that actually means. But
it probably means fewer immigrants.
Well, at least he should say that then, instead of making stuff up. And so I think that's the important discussion to have with them, and if he wants to, he should say it, and then we can have that debate. I would be surprised if immigration isn't a topic of the next election. Certainly in my home province in Quebec, where I'm today, it is openly spoken about, and people openly build political capital on it, and pretty much every party. So I'm not naive enough to think that Canada isn't immune to these debates. The consensus is one that is in Canada that is tenuous. It's still very positive, and it's interesting to dig into those numbers. People, when you look at the numbers and the at least in-depth studies that we see on immigration, people aren't necessarily against immigration. In fact, still very positive about it, but they want governments like ours to get our acts together. They want us to work to make it make sense. And they don't want any sort of immigration. They want it sort of targeted and to fill marked labor needs and areas where we can actually do this in a way that doesn't negatively impact housing affordability, access to healthcare, and access to the education system. I think the sad part of this debate is we only look at this part of the equation and we don't look at the other side of the equation, where a lot of the people that we are bringing in are actually filling the jobs in healthcare, for example, that are the basis of, in part, the Canadian national identity, and lift those up. I think we've gotten lazy as a country about immigration. We just sort of take it for granted and expect that it'll always continue. Some of the negative attitudes that we see towards immigration, obviously from the people that have been here for ages, but also from younger, from diaspora that see numbers and they themselves are scratching their heads about it. So it doesn't sort of cut between newcomer and oldcomer, the views. Sometimes they are very much aligned, and you'd be surprised which provinces have more negative views of immigration than what the political narrative in different parts of the country seems to indicate. For example, Quebec, in one of the studies I read had very open views towards immigration compared to, for example, Ontario, which is just interesting to look at. So I think the consensus is still there. I think politicians like me, politicians from all stripes, have to recognize that this is something positive for the country, but I think we have to also explain it to the population and be a little more proactive in how we do it, as opposed to simply taking for granted and being on our merry way.
Great. Well, that's all we've got time for. Thanks for coming on, Mark. If you would just say farewell to our viewers in Mohawk.
Okay, sure. Onegiwahi se wagoigo.
Good for you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, take care.